Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Spitfire on My Tail, Part 12. The fly past was a success and we all landed back at Eger in good order. Jumping down from our aircraft, we dashed in to change and get into town for Hitler's parade. For the best view, we stepped into the cordon which was there to keep the crowd from the roadway. Although we just took our place in line with the army boys, we really did stand out in our better tailored uniforms and colorful badges. Before Hitler and his acolytes swept past in the huge black Mercedes, some of the local girls had spotted the few of us Fähnriche in our officers' uniforms and gathered behind us to chat, apparently relishing the opportunity to speak German with Germans. They were very pretty, and it wasn't long before we became friends. One girl, Traudl, wanted to know where Hinnerk and myself were staying and was horrified when we said that we had a palace each on the classroom floor. She said that she thought things could be better than that and explained that her mother had been providing billets for Luftwaffe officers. There had been 2 Leutnants there, but they had left unexpectedly to go back to Germany. Traudl said that if we were quick, we could probably secure the places at her home. We had both had enough of the schoolroom floor and in no time at all, we were back at the Quartiermeister asking permission to board out. To our amazement, it was treated as routine, and as soon as we could pack our bags, we were on our way to the Hahn household. It was only in the evening, when Traudl came home, that her parents became aware that we had met before. It was great to be part of a family once more. The Hahns were all in favor of the Sudetenland becoming part of Germany again, but Traudl's 2 brothers were anxious about their future as they were, at that time, well into the courses at the University of Prague. The accommodation was excellent and the food top-rate, but more than anything, it was good to be away from the military whenever we weren't actually at the field. In the evenings, we went out, most of the time with Traudl. Hinnerk had been made a full Oberfähnrich at the time, when I had been passed over and he now wore the full uniform, much more impressive than mine. But that didn't seem to affect Traudl's choice. She seemed to want to spend her time with me. Maybe I was a better dancer, I don't know, but it was nice to be the subject of someone's choice. However, it caused some whispering and a few friendly warnings about the Taschentraualtar, which is the pocket marriage altar. Although we became close and I got on fine with the family, it never came to serious plans to marry. After 2 weeks we were moved out, but I wrote to Traudl for a while. But then we drifted apart eventually. I was learning the soldier skill of making and breaking relationships. We moved to Herzogenaurach at the end of October and all of us were promoted to full Leutnant, effective from September 1st, 1938. I could never understand why they had at first so badly disappointed me and then acted as if nothing had been wrong. But then I thought the important thing was that I'd made it in the end and there was no point in brooding about it. At this time, of course, I still didn't know about the reports made by Oberleutnant Schmidt. I was just happy to give 5 Deutschmarks to the first sentry who presented arms to me as a Leutnant, which was custom, as I walked through the entrance gate of the Fliegerhorst at Herzogenaurach. As a squadron, we were still short of aircraft and I hadn't had much leave for a while, so I decided to apply for a little time off. There were 2 urgent things I had to do. First, I had to order all of my new uniforms and equipment. This was quite a list and included my normal dress uniforms, a white summer uniform, formal mess uniform, a leather overcoat, jack boots, etc. Quite the list indeed. It all came to 1,500 Deutschmarks, but that was no problem. I just had to sign for it and the Luftwaffe Kleiderkasse, which was the clothing fund, would pay the bill. Then they just recouped a small amount from our pay each month. I approached my parents with my woeful story of how we were always on the move, staying in remote barracks miles from any social life. I claimed that if I was to have anything like a normal existence, I would need some transport. They were a little reluctant, remembering the accidents which had occurred when I owned a small moped, but in the end, they agreed. They had themselves put their names down for a Volkswagen, but at that time, neither of them had made any firm steps towards getting their driving license. That was the first obstacle overcome, but then there was the question of actually getting a car. Because of Germany's newfound expansion and rate of economic growth, demand for cars had outstripped production and there was a substantial waiting list for Opels and DKWs, the kind of cars which would be within our price range. Quite by chance, I saw an advert in a Stuttgart newspaper for a DKW. It was not too far from Stuttgart, about 30 kilometers at Schorndorf, so I decided to take the train and look it over. The car belonged to the owner of a waffle factory and was a real beauty. I couldn't believe my luck. It was a DKW Meisterklasse 900cc twin-cylinder 2-stroke motor with wooden bodywork and fabric covering. The upper part was black, but the lower panels had been painted a lovely green. It was only 3 months old and had done just 2,000 kilometers. I went to the receptionist in the factory and told her that I was interested, and the owner, Herr Mössle, explained that he too was a flyer and that he would be more than happy to sell the car to a Luftwaffe Leutnant. He said that he just bought the car for fun to see how it went. He himself had a Mercedes and, having a strong national conscience, thought it was too much to have 2 cars when so many were waiting for one. He wanted a fair price, 2,000 Deutschmark. After just filling in the details of my parents' signed check, I was driving home to Heutigsheim in my very first car. My parents were far from wealthy, but as their treat, they said they would cover half of the price of the car and I could pay off the rest to them at 50 Deutschmarks per month. At that time, I was drawing about 300 Deutschmarks per month, including my Fliegerzulage, and I thought I could afford just one more purchase. I traded in my radio for a portable Blaupunkt, and this too turned out to be an outstandingly good investment. It was a very heavy thing, because it contained a 120-volt accumulator-type battery and a mains lead, but with the aerial raised, we could receive many national radio stations and some from France. I used to have it on the back seat of the car when I was traveling, and when I got back to Herzogenaurach, Hinak Waller and I used to take it to a cafe and use it there. At first, the people didn't like it, but when we regularly had dance music at 5 o'clock and more customers started to come in, we didn't have to pay our bills anymore. That radio stayed with me right into the action that would follow, and when we were moving around in France, the squadron got better intelligence information through that thing than through official channels. My little car served me well indeed, and was often to be seen en route to a town or village, hopelessly overloaded with young airmen. It was wonderful in those days, and I'll always remember my first car much in the way you always remember your first real love. Things were much more stable for us now. The crowd of young lieutenants was constantly changing. Helmut Wick managed to get a transfer to be closer to his fiancée, but Kase and Hinak Waller stayed. Hinak and I were really close friends, and we wanted, if possible, to stay together. But we never knew what the military machine might want. When it came to it, personal circumstances and preferences would not be considered. We just trusted to luck and that we wouldn't be separated. Hitler had undone another part of the Treaty of Versailles and Germany had survived. We could not see that this was just another step in a plan that was aimed at completely destroying the treaty, paragraph by paragraph. Hitler and the NSDAP had seen how the treaty had wounded Germany and what suffering it had caused. If it was one thing they wanted to achieve, it was the final and irreversible destruction of the Versailles Diktat and all it had stood for in post-war Germany. Sometimes Hinak Waller became homesick, which was understandable because he was based a long way from home and therefore he wasn't able to get away as often as myself. I, on the other hand, was based about as locally as I could get. Because of this, I would often change duties with him so that he could take advantage of a few days' leave. At Christmas of 1938, Hinak had been assigned to duty, but he was desperate to be with his family for the festivities, and so I took his duty. Initially, far from being a task, I found that I rather enjoyed my time at the base. The nights were cold and crystal clear with thick snow which crunched under the boots. I would make my rounds of the airfield with all of the sentries calling, "Halt! Wer da?" Then they would jump to attention and report as I gave the password and stepped out of the shadows. After midnight, all of us who were on duty would have Glühwein, and really for the first time I began to feel the comradeship of serving with and commanding a group of men, one of the more attractive facets of a service life. By New Year, it was my turn to go home, and I spent New Year's Eve in the elegant Treifelberg Hotel, high on the Schwäbische Alb, where there was plenty of snow for skiing. I also met old friends and made new ones. Wilfried Rosa was there, for example, having now grown a lot and finished with his school examinations. And it was here that I met Herr Rose from the Zeiss Econ factory near Stuttgart. He took a liking to us and impressed upon me that I should buy an 8mm cine camera, a recommendation which I later followed and which was to have some interesting results. We all managed to stay friends, even if our youthful high spirits did run away a bit at midnight. We had circulated through the crowd like a hurricane, removing the fashionable hats from the ladies' heads and then taking them to the yard. Here we proceeded to blow them up in the air with fireworks. The more fashionable the hat, the bigger the charge that went under it. I wonder how differently we would have celebrated had we realized that it would be the last New Year's Eve that a whole Germany would see peace. Later in January, an order came through to join another fighter group, the first group of Jagdgeschwader 433. Several of us young lieutenants were to be moved at the same time, and so we would be with people we knew. We were leaving Nürnberg and Erlangen, and that had been quite attractive, besides nothing much seemed to happen around Herzogenaurach. Our experience there had shown us that as a fighter group, first group of Jagdgeschwader 333 was a complete non-entity. We were young and keen and wanted something that at least had the feel of action about it. We weren't disappointed. Life was better right from the start at Manching. Our quarters were almost luxurious. Each small flatlet had 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, with the barracks as a whole set into the woods of the Fliegerhorst, which is an Air Force base. The group commander, Graf von Pfeil und Klein Elgut, was as impressive as his name and certainly set the style of the new outfit. The new Gruppe really had the feel of an experienced unit that had teeth to bear. The squadron leaders were all ex-Legion Condor men, and the fact that these were all Spaniards was going to help the group no end. There was no doubt about this. We had already learned that within the Luftwaffe there was a brotherhood of Condor veterans, a kind of old boy network, through which it was possible to get equipment and to get things done. They also exerted a stranglehold in many other ways, which was to become more apparent later. But in the meantime at Manching, all was movement and action. Hardly had we unpacked when a meeting was called to allot us our positions within the squadron. The group commander, Hauptmann von Pfeil, and the squadron leaders were there, as were some other slightly senior lieutenants. Altogether, there were 10 new lieutenants from the class of September of 1938, all looking very much like the new kids in school. The established officers sat around, slouched in chairs, looking us over with an air of nonchalance. Galland himself was smoking one of his cigars. Graf von Pfeil read out our names as we were assigned. I had barely been assigned as Adolf Galland's special assistant of the 1st Squadron when it became obvious that one post had not been filled, that of communications officer for the Gruppe. Graf von Pfeil ordered the job around, but as nobody knew what it involved, there was silence. "It has to be filled," he said. "Any volunteers?" Again, there was silence. "All right, who's the youngest?" I realized with some trepidation that I was, and answered up feeling more than somewhat self-conscious. But I wasn't so overawed by the company that I wouldn't stand my ground a little. I was there to fly the 109, and I wasn't, if I could help it, going to become a pilot of a desk only. I asked respectfully if I could retain my position as special adjutant for flying and still discharge my function to the Gruppe, whatever that might involve. Pfeil thought it over for a moment, glancing at Galland, who nodded his approval, and it was agreed. And thus it was that I became Nachrichtenoffizier, which is the group communications officer for the 1st group of Jagdgeschwader 433. Another piece in the jigsaw of my destiny was pressed into place. After the meeting, we junior officers all got together and fed upon our own enthusiasm. This really did look like a fighter group in the making. 109s were about in numbers, and all the squadrons had delivery dates for more in the near future. Also available, and of more immediate interest to us rookies, was the Me-108 Typhoon, Willy Messerschmitt's predecessor of the 109. It was a 4-seater and still in its bright blue civilian livery, but it also had retractable landing gear, flaps, and the new and innovative leading-edge slats, which operated automatically at slow speeds, changing the wing configuration. It was an ideal aircraft on which to train for the 109. We had the luxury of time with which to be fully experienced before converting to the frontline fighter. But later on, pilots were introduced to the 109 with precious few hours and with a resultingly high attrition rate. With enough experience, the 109 became malleable and stood up well to the roughest conditions, but it could be quite unforgiving, as I was to find out. Our conversion was done in the 108 under the tuition of the NCO pilots. I don't remember the name of my instructor, but my impression is of a soft-spoken and competent pilot. I was far from the first to get training and was a little apprehensive, having seen some of the others before me. Many had had problems, and these had resulted in broken undercarriages, smashed propellers, bent crankshafts, and structural damage to the aircraft. All mechanical. We were fortunate that the damage in human terms was minimal, with few, if any, injuries. I was still desperate to fly, but I had to be patient. As the Nachrichtenoffizier, I was actually part of the Stabskompanie, which is the group staff company, together with the group technical officer and the adjutant. But Hauptmann Pfeil wasn't a Condor veteran, nor was he an expert in the 109, and subsequently he wasn't keen to fly with his own Schwarm. Neither did I occupy a strong position as the titular adjutant of Galland's squadron. I was heading towards being a military jack-of-all-trades, with the usual result. Nobody was making too much fuss to get me trained up, and I would have to wait a while, but in the meantime there were other diversions to occupy us. Late in January, a great event took place. All the young lieutenants from the 1938 courses were to be invited to the Reichskanzlei in Berlin to meet the country's leaders. The invitation was to the young officers from all arms of the Wehrmacht, which is the Army, Navy and the Air Force. It was the first time that such an event had been planned and was typical of some of the rather advanced management which was used by people like Dr. Goebbels. It was all calculated to help bond us to the national leadership and into a homogeneous armed service. The human chemistry worked, the building was breathtaking and the organization outstanding. Hitler gave an inspiring speech which set our emotions racing. Then, all as one body, we had to reaffirm our loyalty to the Führer and the German nation. As we lined up in solemn parade, this slight figure stood in front of us, his eyes steady on ours, giving the feeling that he knew us personally and, if we were to let him down, he would know. It was very emotive and certainly created an impression which was to last, exactly as it had been calculated it would. The Luftwaffe had been the last to be presented and, in the meantime, we began the chant of Herr Mann, Herr Mann, Herr Mann. Göring was there, of course, wearing one of his fancy uniforms and beaming like a fat schoolboy who had stolen the key to the tuck shop. Surprisingly, he didn't take too well to our salute and left before the formal presentation. He wasn't missed, there was too much to do and see. There was a plentiful supply of Sekt and there were lots of old friends to meet, many of them now in the other services. I saw loads of people from the Ludwigsburg school and from my class in Stuttgart. Werner Ruf was there as a Leutnant in the infantry and many others whom I hadn't seen for over a year. So much had happened in just a year, and yet this was nothing compared to what befall us in the coming few years. How tragically depleted that throng would have been if reconvened in the wreckage of the Chancellery in 1945. How few of us would have been there in the tatters of our uniforms. But then, the future was bright and as bubbly as the glasses of Sekt. Nobody seemed to be interested in closing the party, and so it went on into the early morning. It was a memory which lived with all of us for many years. One thing I did discover whilst talking shop in Berlin was the sketchy outline of the duties of the Nachrichtenoffizier. Many colleagues had been given the same job, and at least I got some idea of which books and manuals to read to get the full specification. The more I read, the more I began to realize what was involved. The Nachrichtenzug, which is the communications platoon, should be a unit of 75 men, equipped and trained to operate two 1.5 kilowatt radio stations, together with two field telephone units mounted on trucks and complete with switchboard, cables and telephones. The purpose of this was to enable each fighter group to be an independent unit which could move at will. There were 3 platoons allocated to the staff company: the Werftzug, which is the maintenance unit, which was equipped with spares and tools, even lathes, to keep the aircraft and motor transport functioning, the Nachrichtenzug, to provide ground-to-ground and ground-to-air communications and to plug into the national telephone circuit, and lastly, the Stabszug, which is the staff platoon, who dealt with all administrative matters. The reason why the Nachrichtenzug had most of its equipment duplicated was so that at times of movement, half of the unit could be moved in advance to set up communications at their new base, whilst the other half maintained services at the point of departure. The advance party was transported by air in our own Tante U, which is the Junkers Ju-52M, which was attached to the Stabskompanie squadron. We had the transport, and now it was time for me to appraise my personnel, and this gave me quite a shock. Instead of 75 trained operators, I had just 17 raw personnel. The highest rank was Obergefreiter, and he had served no less than 3 weeks in the glasshouse. The rest of the men came from various places such as Wiesbaden, Bad Aibling and Herzogenaurach. They had one thing in common: they had all served time in military prison, none less than 7 days. What a bargain I had got! It soon became clear that the supply units had taken the opportunity to clean house at my expense. What a hand-picked and highly motivated workforce I had. We had an aircraft to move the unit when necessary, but instead of 75 trained operators, 3 Unteroffiziere and many specialist Gefreite, I had this mostly crew of misfits. And as for equipment, that really consisted of my own Blaupunkt radio, and nothing else had been thought of. It wasn't the ideal proving ground for a young officer for whom this was the first experience of man management and logistics. I went to Graf von Pfeil and discussed the situation. He naturally consulted the Spaniards, and here we got a taste of what was to come: indifference. Why all the fuss? They asked. We did okay in Spain without a Nachrichtenzug. Communications was a job for the Luftnachrichten units, which were the air support groups, so why try? There was no need to clutter up a fighting Jagdgeschwader with that kind of nonsense. I could see that I was really going to be up against it here, and things were to get even more difficult when my Spaniard, Oberleutnant Voigtke, chose to take command of a new fighter squadron which was being formed at Eger. Voigtke had at least been prepared to listen to me, but the new commander of the Stabskompanie, Lieutenant Möllenhoff, was only senior to me in service, and being only a lieutenant and not a Condor veteran, the others wouldn't listen to him, whether he was interested or not. It was a Herculean task for an inexperienced 20-year-old to try to convince his group commander that change should occur, but with the help of the manuals and lists of equipment, I began to make progress. I even tried to convince him to report to Luftgau Commando 7 in Munich that his fighter group was inoperative without any communications, but that was too big a pill to swallow initially, although I didn't feel that I had completely lost the day. Here, I will make some detailed comment on communications and the Luftwaffe, which is the result of some detailed research and my own experience. I don't think there would be much argument that the most valuable thing that came out of the Spanish experience was the tactical invention of the Rotte and the Schwarm. This was evolved by Werner Mölders and was to give the Luftwaffe the edge in combat for a long time to come. However, I am sure that this was somewhat negated by the lack of ground-to-air and air-to-air communications. I have concluded that, at least in the Spanish Civil War, this lack of communications was because the Legion Condor was a clandestine unit and a recording of German language on the radio could have been held up internationally as proof of our participation. But the result was that the Spaniards got used to coping without good communications, using wing signal, etc., and these practices became part of the combat tactics. Again, as the Spaniards exerted a stranglehold on the Luftwaffe, it was extremely difficult to convince anyone that good communications were of paramount importance. Even today, I find the issue very frustrating, and it becomes exasperating when I read in the Jägerblatt of June-July 1985, where Adolf Galland himself commented about communications in an article entitled 45 Years Ago at the Channel. He writes, "Looking back at the Battle of Britain, there was no direct radio communication possible with the bombers due to the different frequencies. A situation almost unbelievable, which amongst others had serious consequences when rendezvous points were missed or escorts and bombers were a little late. When I read this now, it still turns my stomach when I think of all the frustrations I had with this man when trying to sell good communications to the squadron leaders. He and our other Spaniards were so entrenched in their views that they, collectively, put the Luftwaffe well behind and may even have cost us the Battle of Britain by their inflexibility. Adolf Galland was against progress in all forms of communications within the Jagdgeschwader, and he could apparently see no reason at all to have Funkgeräte in a fighter aircraft. Wing signals in the air and a telephone briefing would be sufficient. After all, they had won in Spain, hadn't they? What motivated this apparent obstinacy, I don't know, but maybe it was a desire to be free in the air, unfettered by the ground-based commander or directions from a bomber group. Equally, it could simply have been a complete lack of foresight. One can still only speculate after such a long time. But it still angers me to read comments by a man who, along with his colleagues, was at the root of our poor communications. Not everything was negative though. At each Fliegerhorst there was a Nachrichtenkompanie in residence. They weren't attached to any of the units present, but were responsible for the communications of the field as a whole, including air traffic control, such as it was, Morse, and direction-finding equipment for blind flying. The personnel were drawn from the Navy and Army and were experienced in their role, unlike my hodgepodge of rejects. After action report time, and as we've heard in the video, a drink was mentioned, which means it is time for kitchen diaries, so welcome. Ulrich talked about drinking Glühwein during the Christmas holidays, and again, Glühwein is delicious. Glühwein is a sort of wine that is spiced with cinnamon sticks, cloves, star aniseed, orange sugar, and at times vanilla pods. It is then consumed hot from a glass or from a mug. Sometimes you can even add a Schuss, which means there's a shot of hard liquor in it. And during the wintertime, out in the cold, it is the business, I can tell you. Especially when combined with a nice crepe with chocolate or cream. But be careful, if you drink too much Glühwein, a headache is guaranteed. In other news, I can tell you there are a lot of memories coming back reading this, especially when it comes to being a young lieutenant. I still remember the day it happened to me, as well as the first day with the coveted single silver star on my shoulder. I also remember the fleeting acquaintances, let's put it that way, that one gets to experience as a serviceman. Same goes for relationships that one originally intended to last forever, but they turn out to ride the carousel in your absence, but I digress. I think we all also share the love for our first cars. Mine was what at the time was considered a very bland old man's car, a trusty Opel Vectra with a 2.2-liter turbo diesel engine producing 125 ground-shaking horsepower. It was a car that in the American market was available as a set-on Aura for a short time in the mid-2000s. This ride was for a long time my sole companion on the road and served me happily for 7 years and 150,000 miles. I still miss it to this day. Coincidentally, I paid only a few euros more than the equivalent price which Ulrich paid for his car. That being said, I hope you enjoyed this episode, thank you for listening, and I see you next time. Cheers, bye bye.